Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I draw members' attention to my being the Honorary President of the Scottish Association for Public Transport and Honorary Vice President of Rail Future UK. In the light of that, it will be no surprise that I would always wish to engage in efforts to increase the availability and use of public transport. I, like others, congratulate Jim Eadie on giving us the opportunity to debate this important subject for Edinburgh. When I was Transport Minister, I responded to a Gavin Brown debate on the 3rd of December 2008 on this subject. At that time, I encouraged the City of Edinburgh Council to meet with me as Minister to discuss the issues around what were largely freight lines, although probably, if not less now, less shortly, for passenger traffic. I don't actually recall that happening, so I very much welcome hearing from Jim Eadie that the Council are engaged in the issue. Jim Eadie referred properly to the issues of capacity and technical issues as well at our major stations, and in particular we ought to think too about the issues for those stations of connecting them to a high-speed rail network, which may have different technical standards and will certainly have issues for platform length and capacity. And we need to make sure that we work hand in glove to make sure if we do something on the suburban rail, we don't compromise our ability to connect to high-speed rail in the future. So, would South Suburban Railway Line be of value? Yes, of course it would. Can it be done easily? No, it can't, for many of the reasons that Jim Eadie referred to. It's worth saying on platforms, I think the issue is perhaps not quite as big as it's been suggested. In most cases, it's simply been a question of putting a low platform at the end of the heavy rail high platform, and that's the solution that's been adopted elsewhere. But of course, that depends on there being land available at the stations concerned. The motion says we should explore the viability of reopening the line for passenger use. We certainly should do that. I absolutely agree with that. There has always been a need in Edinburgh for an inner or perhaps middle circle round Edinburgh so that people, precisely as Alison Johnson referred to, don't have to come into the middle to just get in another bus to go back to the outside. And I think that has always been the missing link. And that's why, in many ways, we were uncomfortable as a political party with the trams proposal that ultimately got implemented. Not because trams are a bad idea, they're a very good idea, but the route wasn't the one that perhaps was most urgently needed, and perhaps the route of the suburban railway is the one that we need most urgently. The one thing we do know is when you put rails down and you run trains on them, people come and use them. There's not a single development in the last couple of decades has not significantly exceeded estimations. Now, of course, that is in part because the model that estimates passenger usage is not a good model. It's a GB network model, and it's an issue we need to deal with. I was delighted as Minister to be photographed with Madge Elliott down in the Borders in my time. And of course, that single individual saw from the last train that ran to the reopening recently of the Borders Rail. Now, of course, I can't talk about railways in Edinburgh without making the point that none of my communities in my constituency are anything less than 1.5 hours bus ride away from a railhead. So my support for this proposal is entirely conditional on you also talking about and thinking about the Buckland rail link. I just conclude, Presiding Officer, by saying my enthusiasm for railways is substantial. My wife's Christmas present to me this year was David Spavin's Railway Atlas of Scotland. I commend it to you all. It shows what railways used to be like. Let's try and get some of the way back to where we were. Not all the old railways were worth restoring, but many of them are. Edinburgh South Suburban, but even more important, Buchan Rail.